The Fortune Hunter by Anna Cora Mowatt. Chapter 1. You've displaced the mirth, broke the good meeting with most admired disorder. Macbeth. Money is power, 'tis said. Halleck.
Try a wing of this partridge, Ellery. These are the first of the season. You don't eat. Thank you. I prefer discussing this vol au vent, a favorite dish of mine. By the way, I dare say Alsop will do justice to your delicate partridges. Certainly, my dear fellow. There's nothing like partridge prepared by one of these French cooks. Food for the gods, decidedly. Give me half of one.
3 young men were seated round a table spread with Epicurean viands in one of the private rooms of Delmonico's sumptuous establishment. I said young men, but the term could only be applied par complaisance to the eldest, Mr. Joseph Ellery, or it should be considered in the application as descriptive rather of his appearance than years. The first leaf of his worthy father's family Bible would probably have proclaimed that he had seen the ripe maturity of 40 in days long past, but as that telltale page had been carefully destroyed, as the ladies pronounced Mr. Ellery an accomplished beau, and as he was in the habit of designating himself as a garçon, and more than this, as the united skill of Grandjean and Parmley and Derby and Tryon had been called into action to preserve the bloom of his youth unimpaired, I was only following the example of the fashionable world in ranking him with the young men. The gentleman on his left, who he addressed as Alsop, was one of that large class of young men about town, whose characters are the most difficult to draw because there are no landmarks at which you can begin, inoffensive creatures who seek for pleasure whatever they can find it, and harm nobody so much as themselves. You may describe their well-cut coats, their slender canes, the moustaches they are daily supplicating to give expression to their lips, the color of their hair and eyes, but the features of the internal soul too seldom display themselves to be caught and commemorated. Next to Mr. Alsop, and apparently doing the honors of the table, sat his friend Augustus Brainard. The expression of his face was social, sensual, jovial, and reckless. The twinkle of his bright dark eye seemed to say, "An easy life, a short one if you like, but a merry one for me." His features were all tolerably fine, and after he had paid an hour's devotion to the mirror, they might have been called handsome. His face was full and unfurrowed, a profusion of brownish hair, though carefully training, had been taught to curl about his low, narrow forehead, and a pair of thrifty whiskers, rather strongly inclined to be an auburn hue, formed a not very imperfect semicircle around his cheeks and chin. He was tall and finely formed, his manners polished in the extreme, and always carried about him plenty of the small change current in conversation, but was almost as deficient in banknotes as his own purse. The lively conversation with which the gentlemen were discussing their dinner gave more relish to their food than all Delmonico's piquant sausage. Ellery had commenced one of his most amusing stories, and Brainard had just cut the cork of the first bottle of Clicquot, which flew toward the ceiling with an exhilarating sound, when one of the French waiters, bowing himself into the room, announced that a gentleman wanted to see Monsieur Brainard on one particular business. "What is his name?" demanded Brainard, rather petulantly. "He not send his name, monsieur. He say his name not no matter." "I have no particular business with anybody. Tell him I am engaged with some especial friends. He must call at my rooms." "Oui, monsieur.
but I do tell him so once myself, and he seemed very anxious to come up. Give him my message. I shall see nobody."
The waiter had hardly closed the door before voices from without were heard, engaged in argument. In a moment he reappeared. "Monsieur Brainard, he says he is one of your friends most intimate, and that you will always rejoice very much to see him. He say he must see you, and he not go. Wait till he do."
"Tell him to go to the devil. Do not admit him on any consideration. Be sure that you see him safe out of the house yourself."
"Oui, monsieur." And the waiter turned to the door and placed his hand upon the knob, but it opened without his assistance, and with such ungentle force that it was with some difficulty he escaped being knocked down.
"Ah, Brainard, my dear fellow, how do you do? I knew you'd be glad to see me. I would not send in my name by one of those French jackanapes, for they always murder the president's English, you know. How do you do, gentlemen?" The rosy hue, which half a bottle of fine old Madeira had materially deepened, fled from Brainard's cheeks as he looked up at the salutation of a voice familiar as the grinding organ which played every morning beneath his window, and, like it, alas, always set to the same tune. Mr. Brainard rose from his chair. His particular acquaintance limped confidently into the room, very dexterously managing a club foot and a stiff elbow, and at the same time fixing upon Brainard his light, piercing gray eye with an expression almost benevolent as he extended his hand. The half outstretched hand of Mr. Brainard was quickly seized and honored with a vigorous shake. "Mr. Badger, how—" commencing Brainard. "I'm quite well, thank you. Don't disturb yourself. Sit down. Servant told me you were engaged, but I fancy I smelt dinner, and thought if you'd no objections I'd take a plate with you. These gentlemen, friends of yours, I suppose? Introduce me."
"Mr. Badger, I am really especially engaged this afternoon."
"Don't speak of it. I can wait. No particular business on foot. These 2 or 3 hours. When we've finished dinner, we'll talk at leisure. Partridges, eh? Ducks? Oyster pallies? Champagne, eh? Great country, this. Country for good living. Who treats? You, eh?"
Certainly. Let me help you," replied Brainard, endeavoring to resume his composure. "These are my friends, Mr. Ellery, Mr. Alsop."
"Say no more!" exclaimed Mr. Badger placidly. "Mr. Ellery, how do you do? Alsop, your health. Gentlemen, here's to our better acquaintance."
The toast was drunk very innocently by Mr. Alsop, but Mr. Ellery made an involuntary wry face as he began to feel that he knew quite enough of the gentleman to satisfy him. Mr. Badger helped himself bountifully to a vast number of dishes, filled his tumbler, instead of the narrow-necked champagne glass, with the sparkling and foaming beverage, drew his chair close to the table, and made himself quite at home, begging the other gentleman, with an impressive suavity peculiar to himself, to do the same. A casual observer might well have believed him to be the entertainer instead of a self-invited guest. Mr. Brainard looked on as though the highly seasoned viands had given him a waking nightmare, but Mr. Ellery, after the first moment's surprise, seemed to perfectly understand what was going on, and became more at ease than any other of the party, Mr. Badger excepted. When the conversation flagged with the other gentlemen, Mr. Badger sustained it with enviable facility, in spite of his mouth being full.
"This champagne is sublime, sublime! Brainard, help me to another glass, my dear fellow. Been in this room before, I think. 8 partridges in this very room with a gentleman last September. Poor fellow hung himself in a fit of the blues just week after. I saw to it his clothes being sold, though, to pay a bad debt I had against him. No great business that. Did a better thing this morning. Sublime success. Brainard, do you know Truesdell, the Methodist clergyman?
Quite well. He is a man of great talent. I venerate his virtues.
Quite right. Man of talent, great virtues. Particular friend of mine. Well, about a week ago, Gorham, the bootmaker, honored me with a bill of $20 to collect against him. Went to see him, couldn't pay. Called next day on his pretty wife, fine woman, finest eyes in New York. Got on the tender side of her. She promised to make her husband pay. Called again the next day, wouldn't see me. Well, kept quite quiet till Sunday came. That was yesterday. Went to church early, like going to church. Truesdell was to preach. Got a seat in the first pew, right straight in front of the pulpit. Sat quiet through prayers till Truesdell got up in the pulpit to preach. Then didn't I lean forward and rest my elbows on the front of the pew and hold my chin up with both hands, and didn't I fix my eyes upon him, never stirred them once, looked right straight into the middle of his forehead, like the magnetizers do. No preaching that day, no preaching at all. Tried to do it, but I had my eye on him, and he didn't know what he was driving at. Everybody said it was the shortest sermon they'd ever heard. People went away. I kept as still as a mouse until he came down from that pulpit. Then bolt up to him I went, and thanked him for such a good sermon. Didn't he look pale and red? But he answered quiet as a lamb. Then I asked him in a whisper what time he would see me tomorrow. 9 o'clock, he says, and away I went. Called him this morning, just as the clock was striking 9. Came to the door himself, looking doleful as though he was going to read a burial service. I put the bill in his hand. He put the money in mine, and put his hand on my shoulder. God bless you, my son, says he. Amen, cries I. Great country this. Fine preachers. Fine preachers.
Mr. Badger finished his discourse, more to give himself leisure to finish the dish before him than because he had no more to add on this interesting subject. Mr. Ellery interrupted the silence by saying, "Quite a maneuver of yours, very skilfully done." Mr. Brainard added some faint praise upon Mr. Badger's skill, but Mr. Alsop, who was beginning to feel ennuyé, looked about for his hat and walking-stick, and politely apologized for tearing himself from such agreeable company.
"Talking of business, Brainard," said Mr. Badger, "and now that I think of it, I have a little business with you. Don't go, Mr. Ellery. Nothing private, merely a small bill of Mr. Schofield's that I'll just trouble Mr. Brainard to look over while we're finishing this bottle."
Mr. Badger laid the bill in front of Mr. Brainard's plate, took up his brimming glass, and, as he slowly sipped its contents, looked at Mr. Brainard from out of the extreme corners of his eyes, smacking his lips every once a while as though the last tumbler of champagne afforded him even superior enjoyment to all the others.
"Badger, I'll pay you next week," said Brainard at length. "Thank you, my dear fellow, very obliging, but next week won't do. Mr. Schofield can't wait any longer. Hopes to take a look at the dust tonight."
"I've a great mind to pitch you out the window and make you take a bite of it," muttered Brainard, but in a moment he said, "Badger, don't be a nard upon a poor fellow. I haven't a V in my pocket to bless myself with." First-rate dinner, this, said Badger, abstractly gnawing the bone of a partridge, which he took from the plate. Fine partridges! First I've tasted this season. Call on me Wednesday, Badger, and I'll do my best to settle it. What hour, dear fellow? I like to be punctual, you know. At 12 o'clock. You said you'd like to settle, I think. I will make an effort. Oh, don't let there be any mistake. Haven't much to do on Wednesday. Can see you any hour about this little business. All day long, if you please. Very well. Call at 12. 12 precisely. Good afternoon, Mr. Ellery. I must be going along. Good afternoon, my dear Brainard. Wednesday at 12. No mistake. Don't forget, 12. Mr. Badger, to the great relief of Ellery and Brainard, left the two friends together. That's rather a troublesome acquaintance of yours, Brainard. Can you contrive no way to get rid of him? The only way is to pay him. But the way to pay him, is that so easy? Not with me, just at the present, I assure you. Since Mr. Badger has given you a little insight into the state of my private affairs, and you seem to take some interest in the subject, perhaps, if I draw the veil entirely, you may find it in your power to do me a service. Certainly, certainly. That is to say, if my counsel can be of any service to you, I shall be desirous of proving my friendship. As for any other mode, on my honor, my resources are as slender as my wants are the opposite. The champagne and Mr. Badger have made me communicative, and I have an inclination to forestall you by giving a short history of my own circumstances before I am initiated into yours. I pass with the world at large, as with yourself, for a man of means. That is to say, I dress well, live well, am often seen in places of public amusement, frequently in fashionable society, and take especial pains to run no risk of being visited by Mr. Badger or any of his contemporaries. All this I managed to do on the very narrowest income imaginable, left to me by a maiden aunt, whose odd fancies I humoured for some 15 years before her death. My only secret is this: I never waste small change in any luxuries myself, while I can make anyone else purchase my society by procuring them for me. When I dine at Delmonico's, it is always with a friend, ecce signum. When I attend a ball, I usually take a seat in the cab of some especial acquaintance, who has a particular objection to soiling his boots. My tailor takes a reasonable discount, because I am careful to introduce him to all the rich young blades about town. The Ester house I call my headquarters, because it is respectable, and I always dine there when, by some mischance, I find myself without an invitation. I lodge in Vesey Street, occupy a suite of pretty bachelor apartments, which rent for a mere trifle. Breakfast I prepare for myself, a cup of coffee and a hot roll. Tea I always take with one or the other of my lady friends. With a little economy, I find no difficulty in making both ends meet. And now I have fairly let you behind the scenes. I have reasons for doing so. First, I perceive you are about to do as much for me, and secondly, I foresee that we are going to be sworn friends, and of mutual service to one another. I am afraid you will have to give up the idea of my being of service to you when you hear my story. Not at all. I wish to be perfectly candid. If in the end you do not prove serviceable, it will be my own fault. There is no tie like interest. Therefore this confession should give you greater confidence in my friendship. But to your confession. I am a Baltimorean, as you already know. My father, who was an importing merchant, died a little more than 4 years ago, leaving me a clear 50,000. Until the time of his death I had been his head clerk, and might have continued his business had it been to my taste. It was not. I sold out and travelled south. 2 years and a half I lived, I may say lived, for I enjoyed all the good things of life, upon my 50,000. At the end of that time, to my great consternation, I found my account at the bank overdrawn. The next 6 months I got along well enough on credit. After that it was hard fighting. To cut a long story short, I came to New York 2 months ago because I was unknown here, and because I heard some strange accounts of your good citizens who live by their wits, which made me suppose that even I could weather the storm in such a congenial atmosphere. It was only lately that I became aware of the existence of persons such as Mr. Badger, and now I suppose you know about as much as I can tell you. You are right, but the question is, how are you to extricate yourself from your difficulties? That question I cannot instantly solve. There is such a place as Wall Street, you know. I might make a fortune in a few months by dealing in stocks, or I might take a ticket and draw the prize of some secret lotteries, or I might borrow a few hundreds from some obliging friends, or you might hit upon a better plan than any of these. Wall Street is the place to lose fortunes, not make them. Lotteries yield blanks oftener than prizes. Your obliging friend you would find a more troublesome acquaintance than Mr. Badger himself. I have something surer to propose. Suppose you take a ticket in the lottery of Hymen, I was going to say love, and draw a rich wife. Have you any objections? Not in the slightest, if she will take me. I suppose such a thing is to be had? Easily, if you manage your cards adroitly. Remember, you want a wife with good moral qualifications, as the dandies say, and a liberal father-in-law, or better yet, no father-in-law at all. That is all that a man of sense in your circumstances should desire. Assuredly, I could not request anything more. Well then, to the business. I have a large circle of exactly the kind of acquaintances necessary for you in New York. I shall find no difficulty in introducing you, and at the same time watching your proceedings. I am particularly fond of any little affair of that kind, which keeps my interest alive. What do you say? That I am your debtor for ever if you succeed. Not so. If you do succeed, the obligation will be very easily cancelled. We have no time to lose in putting your plan into execution. Let me see. Mademoiselle Calvé plays at Niblo's tonight. All the fashionables will be there. So will all the good religious people who think that the theatre, where Shakespeare's noble dramas are represented, a shocking place, but will look upon Niblo's little stage, his vaudevilles and rope dancers, as perfectly proper. Suppose we pass the evening there, and you try your luck at losing your heart. Agreed, but I thought hearts had nothing to do with the matter. Why, I presumed you would fancy it more agreeable if you could manage to lose your heart while you were getting a lining to your pocket. For my own part, I believe love has very little to do with happiness. If a man is positively determined that he will be happy, in spite of the circumstances, 9 love matches out of 10 end in indifference or dislike, and if you marry a woman from wise considerations, you are only beginning where the lover ends, and stand a chance of ending where he begins. At all events, you obtain your object for which you are married, which he seldom does. But to not love a woman with whom you are forced to live, not to love? What is not to love? I will tell you. It is not to be certain of quarrelling with your wife, or of being jealous of her, or of having her jealous of you. It is not to begin the day with strife, and end it with tears, and protestations, and reconciliations. I have no doubt you are right, and I admire your philosophy. But the clock has struck 8. Had we better not be on our way to Niblo's? Allons, I am ready. The performance had commenced, and the two gentlemen arrived at Niblo's, and the crowd was so dense that they could with difficulty obtain seats. Brainard directed his opera-glass to the pit rather than to the stage, and commenced questioning Ellery about the numerous pretty faces around them. "Pray, who may that be?" he began. "That? Oh, Miss Blank, a young girl in whom you must not get interested. Nobody of consequence," was Ellery's frequent reply. "Why, my friend, you are selecting all the beauties, and seem to have forgotten that we are here on business. I see I must relinquish listening to the divine Calvé, and must play Asmodeus for your especial benefit. Look to your right in the third box from the stage, front bench. Do you see the young lady leaning against the column? The one in the Quaker-colored silk dress, with the hair that the painters called auburn, but the common people brownish red, a nose decidedly and irretrievably snub, mouth shaped like the letter O, an unhealthy-looking complexion, a small, narrow eyes and lids that make a vain attempt to force themselves open. Upon my honor, fate ought to have made her an heiress to make up for the pleasantries of nature. You surely do not select her for the future Mrs. Brainard." "You must decide upon that. She is the daughter of a very wealthy gentleman of the city, a hardware merchant, who has retired from business. The young men estimate her moral qualities at about $100,000. Look at her again." "Oh, now as she speaks, I observe she has fine teeth and a very pleasing smile. But how should I ever reconcile myself to the tout ensemble?" "Think of Mr. Badger, and her fortune will do that." "Is she an only child?" "No, she has one sister, a few years younger, about 16, I would suppose. She is sitting directly behind her." "Oh, I see her. Really a very pretty girl. Fair skin, fine color, blue eyes, rather heavy and mournful looking, though. A profusion of light hair, hanging rather too carelessly about her neck and shoulders. But how strangely she is dressed, in opposition to all the rules of fashion. There is something odd about her, altogether. Her head leans on one side, and the expression of her countenance is exceedingly languid, or else affected." "The latter, most probably. You would have to play a deep game to win her, and trust a great deal to luck. She fancies herself a heroine, and is in reality something of a coquette. An excessive and unrestrained indulgence in novel reading has spoiled her head, if not her heart. She has become intoxicated with romance, and requires this stimulus as much as the inebriate does his daily dram. She is a creature full of sentiment and sensibility, living on the very breath of excitement, who has sicklied a really fine understanding with too highly seasoned food. She believes every man to be her lover, and every woman her persecutor. She inflicts imaginary woes upon herself for the sake of imaginary pleasures, and a scene is her delight. I have known her from childhood, and I believe the errors of her education are attributable to a weak-minded mother who adores her, and the neglect of a father wholly engrossed by business occupations, and to the pernicious influence of a fashionable boarding schools." "But her fortune, that will be equal to her sister's." "Ah, yes, but she will not be easily won. You will have to seem to suffer for her, to be persecuted for her. You must turn hero to obtain such a heroine." "Trust me for all that." "Then, as a wife, she will not be the amiable, sensible person which you would expect to find in her elder sister." "But her elder sister is a fright. Really, I cannot think of her, that is, unless the younger one rejects me. Pray, by what names am I to designate these two ladies?"
The Misses Clinton, Rachel and Estelle, I should say, for by that name the younger chooses of late years to be called. I am an intimate friend of the family, and will introduce you tomorrow, but you had better prepare yourself by reading Madame de Staël's Corinne, or getting some scraps of poetry by heart. Never fear, you will find me accomplished in my part, quickly responded Brainard. A few moments' silence ensued, during which Brainard appeared to be contemplating the lady whom he destined for his future wife. Suddenly, however, he seized the arm of his friend with some violence. "Ellery, look at the beautiful creature who sits next but one to Miss Clinton. Was there ever anything so perfectly lovely? Is she not of the same party? Pray, tell me who she is." "Take care, Brainard. Remember, hearts have nothing to do with the matter. She is no wife for you. To be more explicit, she has not yet discovered herself to possess any family spoons." "No, but what a Grecian head! What shining dark hair! How classically it is braided around her forehead! What radiant eyes! Is not their expression angelic? Did you ever see a happier face? Everything passing upon the stage seems reflected in her countenance as in a mirror. With what childlike glee she laughs and turns to the gentleman next to her. Who could help admiring such naivete, such beauty?" "Remember Badger?" "Pshaw!" "Tell me who she is, Ellery. I can admire her without marrying her, can I not?" "Her name is Walton. Her history is a rather interesting one. When quite a child she was placed by her uncle under the care of Mr. and Mrs. Lemming, who then kept a very excellent seminary for young ladies. The Misses Clinton were her schoolmates, and an intimacy arose between them and Miss Walton, which continued, although the Clintons were removed for the last 4 years of their education to Mrs. O'Kill's more fashionable boarding school. Miss Walton is the age of Ester. The Lemmings have given up school, but she still remains with them, for her uncle is a most singular individual, and she has neither mother or father. This uncle, Mr. Mordaunt, about 18 years ago, was a highly esteemed and talented lawyer, who, everybody expected, would in a few years be at the head of his profession. I knew him well. He was an agreeable fellow in society, but passionate and revengeful in the extreme. Suddenly everything seemed to go wrong with him. He neglected his business, grew moody and silent, and seemed to take no further interest in the affairs of life. This disposition has continued until the present day. As far as I am acquainted, he never had but one brother and a sister, both of whom died suddenly 16 or 17 years ago. They were both unmarried, yet he calls this child his niece, and it is presumed she is merely an adopted one. Although he is now a hard-featured, morose-looking man, the resemblance between him and Miss Walton is so strong that I have heard it whispered that she is his illegitimate daughter. This I think more than probable, although he never shows her the slightest fatherly affection. He is a bachelor, and owns a 3-story house near the Battery, where he lives with one old family servant. The lower story of the house is the only part ever used. The rest remains unopened and uninhabited this many year. He receives no friends and visits none. His circumstances are desperate, in spite of his talents, which appear of late years to be completely paralyzed. His only property is the house of which I speak. Many advantageous offers have been made to him if he would sell this house, but he seems determined to refuse them all. Yet the comforts of a home he never enjoys, for Miss Walton continues to reside with the Lemmings. What a brute he must be! And she is she not bewitchingly beautiful? Yes, but since I have convinced you that she does not possess the requisite qualifications for you, her beauty is of little importance, answered the money-seeking Ellery. Brainard sighed, fixed his attention a few minutes on the stage, and, when his head turned again, it was to contemplate the fair Ester. "Who
is this young man beside Miss Esther? Estelle, I should say. The son of Dr. Chadwick, an eminent surgeon of the city. An elegant-looking fellow, truly. Is he paying his addresses to Miss Estelle? Not that I am aware of. He seems more fascinated with the lovely Miss Walton. Uselessly so, however, for his family, who belong to our elites, would never consent to the match. For the rest of the evening Brainard devoted his attention to Mademoiselle Calvé, and seemed to hear nothing but her thrilling voice until the curtain fell. As he was passing from the illuminated garden to the street with Ellery, he found himself directly behind the Clintons. Their elegant private carriage was standing at the entrance, but, as usual, there was some difficulty with the hackmen, who were furiously whipping their horses and swearing at each other, in total regard of everybody present. Just as Esther's foot was on the step of her father's carriage, the whip of a half-intoxicated coachman accidentally struck one of the highly mettled horses attached to it. Instantly he began to plunge and rear, springing towards the sidewalk. "Quick! His rein! Quick! Catch the horse's rein, and you are made!" whispered Ellery, pushing Brainard forward. Brainard comprehended him, and, thrusting aside a couple of gentlemen who were going to offer their assistance, he rushed up to the rearing animal and seized him boldly by the rein. The horse instantly became quiet, but Brainard, who knew his position was a graceful one, remained, forcibly holding up the creature's head, with his eyes fixed upon Esther. That young lady tottered backward, and looked as though she thought this a very proper occasion to faint, but had not fully concluded upon doing so. Brainard's position and timely aid were not, however, lost upon her, and when he ventured to come forward and hand her into her carriage, she raised her eyes to his, with an expression which Fanny Kemble might have studied, and murmured, "My deliverer." "Bravo, Brainard!" exclaimed Ellery. "Fortune has made up her mind to smile upon you. That little scene made more impression on the fair lady's heart than a 5-month courtship could have done. Tomorrow you must call upon her, with me, to inquire as to the state of her health after her terrible accident. Do not forget you saw her extreme peril, and that your arm is lamed in consequence of protecting her. Suppose you wear it in a sling. As you please. Tonight we tried the graceful, tomorrow we assume the interesting. Anything to escape having one's digestion injured by Mr. Badger." End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. O blessed with temper whose unclouded ray can make tomorrow cheerful as today. Pope. Light from her makes many faces bright. Taylor. A few days after the evening spent at Niblo's, Miss Rachel Clinton alighted from her carriage at the door of Mr. Lemming. She entered without ringing, and was ascending the stairs when the parlor door opened and a sharp-visaged face peered forth. "Who's there? Oh, is it you, Miss Clinton?" Rachel's ears were familiar with that harsh, shrill voice, yet it sounded so unexpected from behind her she could not help starting. "It is I, Mrs. Lemming. Is Miss Walton at home?" "Yes, she is in her chamber. Will you not walk into the parlor?" she added, in a more courteous tone, at the same time opening the door sufficiently for the whole of her tall, gaunt, and shriveled person to become visible. "Thank you, I will go to Arria's chamber." "It's always Arria's chamber," muttered Mrs. Lemming, as she shut up the door somewhat urgently. "One would suppose there was nobody living in the house but Miss Arria. They will find some day who is mistress here, and will have to look up for their pretty favorite somewhere else, I can tell them." Rachel, with a quickened step, ascended to the 3rd story, and, without knocking, entered the apartment of her friend. Her step was so light that she was unnoticed by Arria. and she could not help pausing on the threshold to contemplate the chastely beautiful tableau before her. The room was small, but what perfect neatness reigned throughout, and how much of the character of its occupant could be read in its little arrangements. The floor boasted no better covering than a rag carpet, and there were but 2 rickety chairs against the wall. The narrow trundle bed in one corner was adorned with a patchwork quilt representing the rising sun, the work of Arria's own hands. A miniature stand in another corner held a tumbler filled with flowers, its base surrounded by a circle of evergreen moss, among which some golden-hued beach shells were fancifully embedded. Several fine engravings were nailed to the wall, and wide black tape bands were neatly fastened around them, an ingenious substitute for frames. A picture immediately over the bed represented Raphael's Messiah, and directly above it hung a wreath which, at first glance, might have been taken for a delicate painting. Rachel knew that it was not so, for she had seen the flowers culled, pressed in a manner to retain their color, then carefully attached with a pellucid gum to paper, and after that the paper cut away, leaving a crown of natural flowers, the hues of which remained unperishing. At the foot of the bed was a small hanging library, well filled, and beneath it a large box, crammed with books for which there was no other repository. The window was open, and a rude shelf without it held a dozen pots of monthly roses, mignonettes, and geraniums. A canary bird was singing in a wicker cage, which was fastened to the shutter, and in front of him, on a low bench, sat Arria. The loose white robe, slightly girdled at the waist, showed to advantage the outlines of her slender but well-developed figure, and formed exactly the contrast to her dark and simply knotted hair which a painter would have desired. She was bending over her work, every once a while raising her head to look at the canary and imitating his notes with a low murmuring sound as she plied her needle. "Why, Arria, have you eyes for your canary alone?" said Rachel after her pause. "Dear Rachel, have you indeed come to spend the morning? How kind in you!" "I have come to visit your bower, as Esther would call it. And indeed, dear Arria, even such unromantic persons as you and I might apply that term to your little chamber without its being more poetical than appropriate. And the bower has more than one bird in it." "We will make it a bower of joy, then," said Arria gaily, "and the songs of the bird shall always be blithe. But throw off your hat, and take my little bench there. Now lean back against the cornice, and you will find the seat about as convenient as an armchair. You see, I study comfort. Other people's comfort you have always studied. And my own, too. Besides, I take comfort in seeing others comfortable. Have you brought your work? To be sure. Do you suppose I would venture into a hive of a bee such as you without it? Nay, I shall think you are showing your sting in the hive if you laugh at the restless quality that keeps me always employed. Now confess, can there be anything more agreeable than for 2 friends who love each other as we do, to be shut up together in a cozy little chamber such as this, with our fingers and our tongues equally employed, opening our hearts to each other whenever we open our lips? And do you suppose we should chat half so freely or naturally if our hands were idle? As for me, I should find some difficulty in keeping mine away from mischief." "There was a time when I might not have comprehended your argument, but as of late you have quite inoculated me with your industrious mania. Pray, how came you by it?" "My industry, as you call it, is partly constitutional, and partly springs from the conviction that our time in this world is at best so short that we ought to take advantage of every minute. Tell me, dear Arria, what is the reason that you always look so smiling and happy? How do you manage to take an interest in everybody and everything? How comes it that you find enjoyment everywhere? How am I going to answer all these questions without showing a great deal of vanity? However, my vanity shall not interfere with your wishes. In the first place, then, you must know that I have 1,000 everyday causes and sources of happiness. What are they? You are not rich. You are an orphan. Your uncle is, forgive me, a tyrant. You live secluded. You are forced to work for yourself, make all your own clothes. You are— "Stop, stop, stop!" cried Arria, placing her delicate hand over the mouth of her friend.
Am I not young and in health?
Have I not friends who love me, and opportunities of enjoying their society? Have I not books, and time, and inclination to read them? Have I not the most invaluable of guardians, the best counselor and friend in Mr. Lemming? As for my uncle, you do him an injustice. He permits me almost always to do as I like. And you know some wise person has said, the only way to please a woman is to let her have her will. But these are the things enough to make you happy. One secret of my happiness is, I never suffer myself to be idle. If anything annoys or grieves me, after trying to philosophize, do not be frightened at that long word, upon it for a while, and to try to find out what good may proceed from it, I take up an interesting book, and forcibly fix my attention on that, or I busy myself with my needle, or employ myself in any way that occasion offers. I believe that almost anybody may be happy, or at least contented, who earnestly desires to be so, who feels convinced that God placed his creatures on earth for their enjoyment here, and that they might so perfect themselves as to be capable of higher enjoyment hereafter, and that almost all their misery proceeds from the violation of physical, civil, or divine laws. I am indebted to kind Mr. Lemming for many of my ideas on this subject. I have been taught to believe that any yielding to discontent and morbid melancholy is an actual sin, that it has so molded the spirit as to render it less capable of happiness, and consequently more susceptible of misery, and that this impulse, communicated to the soul, would affect our future as well as our present life. Yet it is not always possible to resist a sensation of depression and weariness. Perhaps not, when that sensation springs from physical causes, but if from mental causes, it is possible. Are we not most apt to find what we look for? If I should ever keep it in mind to observe how many sources of evil there are in life, I should probably contemplate nothing but misery. But my inclination led me to observe the sources of happiness. I should find food for enjoyment everywhere. Do you remember the anecdote of the painting which some Italian artist put in the marketplace, desiring everybody who looked upon it to point out its defects? When he came for his painting at nightfall, he found every part of the drapery and every feature marked as defective. The next day he placed it in the same position, desiring those who passed by to point out its beauties. Again he found his painting covered with marks, but they were of approbation. Something to admire had been discovered in every touch which, on the previous day, had been condemned. So it is that we find exactly what we look for. But tell me, Arria, have you never any causes of unhappiness for which you do not seek? Perhaps I have a few causes that would make me unhappy if I permitted them to do so. But will you not tell them to me? I do not ask out of mere curiosity. I have been reflecting a great deal on these subjects as of late, and I wish to judge of the justice of your assertions. I am an orphan, and I often feel the absence of a mother's love. My heart yearns to know something, to form some idea of her who gave me birth.
that I may think of her and love her as a bright and holy being dwelling in heaven. But when I attempt to speak on this subject to my uncle, he silences me with sternness. For that uncle, too, I feel an affection which he never permits me to express. I long to do something to cheer his gloom, to be more frequently with him, that I may exert a happier influence over him. It gives me pain not to be beloved, and I cannot but realize that he has no tenderness for me. And then I know he is embarrassed in his circumstances, and that my expenses here make a troublesome call upon his purse. I lately proposed to him that he should permit me to become a teacher in some school, but he rejected my proposition with indignation. I am a burden upon him, and am becoming one upon Mr. Lemming. Inasmuch as my uncle is somewhat in his debt, then I am in want of many little necessities, with which I can ill dispense, and I have no means of supplying myself. That is, I had none until Dr. Chadwick kindly procured me a ticket for the Ladies' Depository, so that I am enabled to dispose of the produce of my needle without troubling my uncle or wounding his pride. Look, is not this scarf beautifully embroidered? I really took pleasure in forming these roses. It is for the depository. Do you think it will sell? Yes, yes. But go on with the causes of your unhappiness. Well, then, I really believe I have enumerated all. Let me see. Oh, yes, then I am very fond of society, of social intercourse, of the opera, concerts, etc. With the exception of your family, my uncle forbids me to pay any visits unaccompanied by him, and as for concerts and opera, I know but little of them. But then your society is a great deal. My bird makes good music at home. There. Now I have enumerated all my woes and grievances. They do not make a very formidable array. But are you satisfied? Is this all? Yes, all I can remember. You have forgotten Mrs. Lemming's harsh disposition, her habitual unkindness towards you. I believe it would kill me to live in this house with such a woman. You wrong her. She is not unkind. It is her way. That is to say, her manners are a little peculiar. And if you think of her causes which impaired her disposition, you could easily forgive her. She is childless, and she has longed so earnestly to become a mother. Had she a child, it would inherit the property left by her aunts, which must otherwise descend to some very distant branches of the family. I find this no excuse for her peevish humor and her dislike to be beholding to the happiness of others. But think of how good Mr. Lemming is. Yes, he adores you, and who does not? How I envy your temperament. I have none of your sources of discontent, yet I am not half so cheerful. But then I have one annoyance which you have not. Nature has made me so very, very ugly. And you are so beautiful, she exclaimed, gazing admiringly upon her friend. Oh, no, Rachel, answered Arria with energy. You are not ugly. How could anyone be ugly with such a lovely soul as yours? Does not Shakespeare say, in nature there's no blemish but the mind, and that virtue is beauty? You are not ugly to those who love you. You were never ugly to me. In spite of Rachel's homely feature, less partial eyes than those of Arria at that moment would have looked upon her as not ugly. Her light gray eyes, generally so dim-looking and languid, were illumined by an expression of admiring affection, and the smile about her ill-shaped mouth disclosed teeth of brilliant whiteness, while it animated every feature of her face. Besides this, the winning sweetness of her voice forced you to think of the beautiful internal, which lent a charm even to so plain an exterior. You are partial, Arria, but I am ugly, and I have some reason to feel it bitterly. My nurse used to call me a little fright. My very mother has reproached me for my ill looks, and in earlier years refused me the finery with which she decked out my younger sister. Sometimes I have felt like a criminal for being so ugly, and thought that even the eyes of strangers could not rest upon me without pity. I almost hated myself. Many and many a time, when quite a child, have I made grimaces at the homely visage which my mirror reflected, and turned from it with tears of anger. I could not comprehend why Esther should have been so fair, and I so devoid of charms. I have tried, and partially succeeded in conquering these feelings, but sometimes my unprepossessing appearance makes me so dissatisfied with myself, and with everybody else, that I am utterly wretched. What a very crooked magnifying glass that pair of eyes yours must be! But even if you were the frightful personage you imagine yourself, what matters the covering with which your spirit is to wear but a few years? When death comes, you throw it off, and your spirit rises in the holy loveliness with which your virtues have endued it, transcendently beautiful forever. Why should you care what texture of your body may be, when your soul, which is yourself, becomes peerlessly lovely through your own acts? Do you believe, then, that the soul has a form or a shape, any more than ether has? How could I believe otherwise? Have not the angels, which the Bible tells us have appeared to men, been in the form of human beings? Were not Moses and Elijah seen by the disciples in the form of men? The vulgar idea is that the soul re-enters the material body on the judgment day, but the judgment day had not come. That is the judgment day many expect. I believe every man's judgment comes immediately after his death. If our spirits were but ether, how could they, in another world, exercise the faculties which they have enjoyed here? And what would existence be without those faculties? That we can possess them, independent of the senses, natural somnambulism proves, for in that state all the senses are laid asleep, yet the spirit operates. The natural eye is closed, or if it be open, it is sightless, yet the eyes of the spirit take cognizance of the objects by which it is surrounded, and even penetrate distances which no natural vision could reach. I look upon the body as not more necessary to the soul, not more a part of it, than your dress is part of your body. One is accidentally, hereditarily beautiful. The other becomes beautiful through our own efforts to conquer natural evil and implant good in its stead. Every good act, then, leads another charm to the spirit. Truly, for such a fright as I am, your doctrine should be quite an inducement to goodness. But can there be any real goodness, dear Rachel, unless the motive is purely good? If you performed any noble or charitable act from any other motive than because it was pleasing to God, and out of genuine love for goodness, apart from all considerations, would the act be truly good? I cannot see any objection to the truth of your reasoning, and certainly your doctrine is a happy one, and in harmony with the perfect justice which we believe to be an especial tribute of our beneficent Creator. Do look at this bud. Have I not finished it quickly? Never call yourself ugly again, will you? I cannot promise, but when I think myself so, I will remember that my soul may possess charms which have been denied to my person. Was not that a carriage that stopped? Yes, it is Estelle. She is coming in. When I left her, she said she had some purchases to make, and would come for me afterwards. But why will you call her Estelle? She likes it, and why should I not? the name which it pleases her best to hear, is most agreeable for me to pronounce. But it sounds affected. It would not have sounded so to you if she had been christened by that name, therefore the affectation is only ideal. To call her as she desires is to gratify her in a very innocent way. There you are certainly wrong, for you encourage that romantic disposition of her which leads her. Rachel was interrupted by the entrance of Ester. Lovely Arria, sweet sister mine, I am rejoiced to see you. Arria rose to welcome and embrace Ester, but she, without returning the caress, sank into a chair and fixed her eyes mournfully upon a garland of flowers which she held in her hand. "What a lovely wreath!" exclaimed Arria admiringly. "Where did you get it?" "I know not," replied Ester, without raising her eyes. "Know not where you got it from? Did it fall from the skies?" exclaimed Arria. "Did you find it in the street?" said Rachel. "In the street," replied her sister indignantly. "I received it from an unknown hand." "How did the unknown hand present it?" asked Rachel. "Do gratify our curiosity, good little Estelle," Arria joined in. "Remember, we are only everyday mortals, and are strongly prone to the failing of our mother Eve." "You shall be gratified," replied Ester solemnly. "I had entered Stewart's. The carriage stood at the door. I was absent but a moment, when I returned to see this garland lay upon the seat, with this inscription attached to it." As she uttered these last words, she drew from her bosom a small slip of paper. "Let us see the paper! Let us see the paper!" exclaimed Rachel and Arria simultaneously. "Never! The emotions of a feeling soul should not be profaned by the eyes of the world." "Did you not ask the coachman who placed the wreath in the carriage?" inquired Rachel. "No, I could not stoop to communicate with a menial on the subject," she replied. "Could you not guess from whom it came?" asked Arria. "As the carriage moved away, I saw a face that was familiar to me. It was that of Mr. Brainard." "The gentleman whom Mr. Ellery brought to pass Friday evening with us?" asked Rachel. "Yes, the one who so heroically stepped forward when my life was in danger, and he rescued me." "And of course," returned Rachel, smiling, "you are duty-bound to be eternally grateful to him." "The heart may not be forced," replied Ester, with a sigh, drooping the lids of her really beautiful eyes as she pushed the wreath from her. "I am glad, sister, that your heart is in that condition," continued Rachel. "For my opinion of Mr. Brainard, although I may be judging hastily, is that his head and heart are equally light, and that he is wanting in good sense and depth of feeling to balance either of them." "A noble nature must ever be incomprehensible to meaner souls," replied Ester, the sublime and pathetic tragically mingling themselves in her voice. "Such is the inevitable decree of fate." "But it was never yet the fate of flowers to fade in my chamber for lack of attention," said Arria, springing up lightly and immersing the wreath in water before Ester could prevent her. By the time that Arria had arranged every flower in the garland to her liking, and so disposed the leaves that the water should touch and refresh without injuring them, Ester was apparently lost in a reverie. Her hands were clasped on her lap, her head drooped on her bosom, and her negligently arranged hair, picturesquely arranged, she would have called it, fell about her shoulders and completely concealed her face. Arria's smile was changed into a half sigh as she gazed upon her, But she knew Esther's temperament too well to disturb her, and quietly reseated herself by the side of Rachel. A few moments they plied their needles without speaking. Rachel was the first to break the silence. "Do you know, Arria, that since I have not said to you half what I came here to say this morning to say, and do you know I am afraid to go on, lest you should think I have caught some of—" Rachel's glance toward Esther made Arria divine the conclusion of the sentence. Before the words could be uttered, her finger was on Rachel's lip, and her eyes bent hers with an expression that said, "Spare her. You ought to spare her. You need not be afraid to make any confidential communications to me on the grounds that I shall laugh at you," she said aloud. "Goethe said that it was only necessary to grow old to become indulgent, for that he saw no fault committed which he had not committed himself. And I, without growing old, have too often the same reason which the German had for tolerating the faults of others. Will you go on now?" "I have come to the conclusion," resumed Rachel, "that I will not be made miserable in this world through my own folly. I observe that most women are not calculated to live single, and yet become wretched through marriage. My father is reputed to be rich, and is rich. Esther and myself are therefore heiresses, and as heiresses are sought after in a manner which we might be spared under ordinary circumstances. Even I, in spite of these sandy locks and this unlovely exterior, have not been without suitors, who protested that my heart alone was what they desire. Fortunately, I am under no delusion with respect to my person, and I know the esteem in which my beauty is held. I mistrust all my pretended admirers. They would wed not unalluring me, but my father's more alluring gold. Without that gold, I should probably be free from all solicitations. To me, then, riches are not a blessing. I cannot conceive why old maid should be so odious a term. I have this morning had a long conversation with my father, in which I entreated him to make a will debarring me from all participation in his fortune beyond a very small competence, and to make his determination publicly known. After great entreaty he consented. I shall now be able to test if any lover is as unalloyed as the gold which I have renounced, and I run no further risk of being duped. I have prepared myself to live ever as I am, and I hope to prove that an old maid may at least be an amiable being, ever willing to bestow pleasure in any way in her power, and ever at leisure to serve those around her, to sympathize with their pains and their pleasures, and to find her joys in theirs. What say you to my arrangements? Think you I have grown too romantic to be rational? I think the determination to which you have arrived will render you happy. And what are the riches which you have renounced if they could not bring you that happiness?" "You do not think my resolution the effect of mere romance, then?" asked Rachel. "Only the romance of reality." "What is reality?" exclaimed Esther, who appeared to hear but the last words. "There is nothing real but misery." "Nothing is so ideal as self-made misery, sweet Estelle," replied Arria, winding her arm around Esther's neck. "And this little chamber I call my bower of joy. Therefore you must smile here. The lip may smile, and not the heart. Hearts are troublesome things, and I shall begin to think Estelle has lost hers, and is mourning over her misfortune unless she cheers up. But oh, why did I not think of it before? Rachel, Estelle, it is very pleasant to have you here, but do you not think we had better spend a few more moments in the parlor? Mrs. Lemming does not quite seem to like your visiting me so frequently and never paying her deference of a call." Mrs. Lemming seldom likes anything, I am afraid," said Rachel. "I promise you she will like it if you pay her a visit this morning. Come, Estelle, will you go?" "I? Think you I can have sympathy with a sour disposition of a Mrs. Lemming? There can be no harmonious interchange of thought and feeling between us, and her jarring chords would spoil the music of my life." "Come, you may not have sympathy with her, but you will pay her a visit to gratify me. Come, I never take nay for an answer when I want to hear yea. I am sure you will both go to oblige me, so let's away." Arria caught a hand of each of her friends and drew them toward the door with such a gentle but persuasive force that they could not but yield to her request. Esther with a deep-drawn sigh, and Rachel without remonstrance, for her new system of being an agreeable old maid probably prevented the display of any. "3 visitors for Mrs. Lemming!" exclaimed Arria, gaily flinging the parlor door wide open. "Permit me the honor of introducing them," continued she, in mimic formality. "Mrs. Lem—" She stopped suddenly, for she had advanced several steps into the room without observing that Mrs. Lemming was not alone. Beside her sat a young gentleman of 23. In stature he was somewhat below medium height, but his formation was remarkably symmetrical, and there was nothing about him which even the tongue of malice could call unmanly. What was it but the spirit which could have given such graceful dignity to his form? His countenance was strikingly handsome, even beautiful, yet not a lineament denoted effeminacy. His head was a study for a painter, and to have examined its developments would have been a delight to Spurzheim. Nature's own hand clustered the dark curls around his high, broad forehead. Genius had kindled the light of that mild hazel eye, over which the elevated brows inclined to an arch. But the especial charm, as far as mere features were concerned, was in the mouth. Its expression was so gentle, yet firm, full of sweetness, yet fuller of dignity, and when a smile played about the lips, it almost seemed as if flashes of light were darting over that serene countenance, while they called forth 1,000 new beauties with every gleam. "Your visits, ladies, were intended for me," began Mrs. Lemming, with no little quality of sarcasm in her tone. "Especially Miss Arria's, I presume. Pray be seated." Arria colored deeply, but the salutation of the ladies and gentlemen passed over without Mrs. Lemming's remark being further noted. Rachel seated herself beside Mrs. Lemming, and Mr. Chadwick, taking a chair between Estelle and Arria, commenced an animated conversation. Estelle's manner toward him was marked by an air of tender languor, as though his presence imparted to her a pleasure almost oppressive. The instant her attention was for a moment diverted by Mrs. Lemming, Chadwick turned to Arria and said in a lower tone, "How shall I thank you for this goodness? I was just despairing of seeing you." "The goodness was very unpremeditated." "You did not, then, know I was here?" "Not unless I discovered it by a species of magnetic intelligence." "But you do not regret finding me here?" "Oh, no," replied Arria with unaffected warmth. "Add one word more. Say you are glad." How often it is that there is more in a tone in which words are uttered than in the words themselves. Arria felt the full meaning which that melodious tone conveyed to her inmost soul. She felt, too, what pleasure or what pain her answer could excite, and she did not for a moment withhold the frank and ready, "Oh, yes." Mr. Chadwick would have answered, though his language could not have spoken half that his expressive countenance said for him, but the door opened, and Arria sprang forward to greet the visitor. That tall, majestic form hardly bent to receive her embrace. and the stern, cold brow relaxed not at her offered kiss. Yet there was a likeness between the two, in spite of the unlikeness produced by an entirely opposite expression. The oval face, the large dark eyes, rather deeply set, the long lashes, the strongly marked eyebrows, the purple darkness of the hair, profuse and shining. But this was all. The one face good angels seemed to have guarded from every furrowed trace by gnawing care and withering passion, to have stamped it with their own infinite charity and love. The other showed the scars of a spirit at war with all mankind, of a soul blighted by evil passions, brooding remorselessly over its own guilt. "Uncle, dear uncle, how long it has been since we have seen you! Have you been ill?" "No," was the laconic answer, with which Mr. Mordaunt took his seat, apparently indisposed for further conversation. Arria placed herself beside him, and, as it was not in accordance with her nature to remain silent, she prattled away, although to an apparently inattentive ear. Meanwhile Esther had resumed her conversation with Mr. Chadwick. "You do not usually visit in the morning," said she. "No, I brought this volume of Stephen's Travels to Mr. Lemming. He desired to see it, and under that cover I had an excuse for an early morning visit." A smile, almost animated, passed over Esther's face. "I thought you had some excuse, but how came you to know that I was here? Ah, I remember now. I mentioned last night that I intended visiting Arria today, and you remembered it, did you?" Mr. Chadwick looked somewhat surprised, and then perplexed, but at this direct question replied with a gallantry which did not become him so well as did his usual manner. "I always try to remember the words of a lady." "And you are so successful in making use of them. But you might be pardoned what— Esther, is it not almost time for us to bid Arria good morning? It is nearly 3, and father so much dislikes to be kept waiting," said Rachel. "Why is it that there are beings to whom the sensual things of this life are all in all?" murmured Esther, distinctly enough for Mr. Chadwick to hear. Rachel soon rose to take leave, and Esther, of course, was obliged to accompany her. "Sister, you have forgotten your wreath." "It matters not, for I only remember the giver to think of the pain which I forcefully occasion him." "Can I bring it to you?" asked Mr. Chadwick, as he handed her into the carriage. "No, though its value would then be more than doubled." Mr. Chadwick could not but bow in acknowledgment of these words. The doze was closed, away flew the horses, and Esther's white handkerchief waved from the window until a bend in the street hid her from his sight. "She is an enigma. I wonder if she knows her own meaning," mused Mr. Chadwick as he re-entered the house. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. My judgment owns her exquisite perfections, but my rebellious heart denies her claim. Hannah More. Circumstance that unspiritual God, a miscreator, makes and helps along, are coming evils with a crutch-like rod, whose touch turns hope to dust. Byron. "Hallo, Brainard! Here I have been knocking at your door this half-hour. Did you imagine I was Badger? But what ails you? Have you got the blues? You wear a rather doleful face for a man with your brilliant prospects." As Mr. Ellery entered the chamber of Brainard, the latter gentleman was sitting beside a small round stand, which held an empty bottle and a wine-glass. His feet were carelessly rested in a position somewhat higher than his head. The cigar between his lips was but half smoked, yet its fire was extinguished. and the grey ashes had fallen entirely unnoticed upon his richly embroidered vest. "Ellery, how do you do? Glad to see you. Sit down. We'll have another bottle. That's right. Now you look more like yourself. What in the name of everything that's horrible were you ruminating on? Upon matrimony, a very serious subject, is it not?" "I see nothing so very serious in a rich wife and her agreeable accompaniments. True, but let me fill your glass." "Certainly, if, as I empty it, you will let me understand why your head is so full. Everything prospers, does it not? It is 3 weeks to-morrow since you were first introduced to Miss Estelle, and she has received your flowers, carried your verses in her pockets, thrown her glove out the window at your serenades, and, even after a little persuasion, met you at the fountain in Union Park. Is it not so? Yes, she listens to everything I have to say, replies with a deep sigh, and once in a while she murmurs, 'Unfortunate young man,' as though she dreaded that some calamity were about to befall me. Still she does not withhold her dangerous smiles. No, though they have never placed my heart in much peril yet. Ellery, in a word, I do not love her," burst forth the young man, with an energy which he had never displayed before. "Such a woman I could never love. And when I see her beside that angelic Miss Walton, and hear her affected tones contrasting with the moving music of Arria's voice, I almost hate her. It was on this fact that I was just pondering. What a different creature might not the gentle influence of such a being as Arria Walton make me? My nature would become softened by hers. She would inspire me with virtues that I had never before desired to possess. I should grow pure through her purity, and I could learn to look at the heaven her finger pointed out. In her presence I have felt springs of feeling which the polluting atmosphere of the world had choked up unsealed in my bosom. Were Arria my wife, pleasure would no longer be my idol, nor self my god. I should become a man, an honorable, upright, intellectual being, fulfilling a noble destiny, not the slave of dissipation, ever athirst, forever yet sated with enjoyment." "What a delectable picture you have drawn," said Ellery coolly. "Let me now finish it by filling in the most important character. You have forgotten your Laertes and Penates, namely, Mr. Badger and his assistants." Brainard seemed to awake, as if from a dream, at the sound of that cabalistic name. "Listen to me, my young friend," continued Ellery, "but first answer me one question. Have you had any further visits from your inconvenient acquaintance as of late?" "I have escaped him 3 times last week, but I had to dodge about like a thief, and almost expect to see him start out of every dark corner." "Have you made up your mind, then, that it is the part of a sensible man to cut his acquaintance?" "Yes." "And you know of no better mode of doing than by marrying Miss Estelle Clinton?" "No." "I'll try it again. This confounded wine is too heavy, and had got into your head, that's all. Cure yourself homeopathically. A few more glasses will bring you back to where you were when you began. Now let us see how matters stand. Miss Estelle does not reject your attentions, yet she evidently inclines to pay hers to Mr. Chadwick. There's no danger, however, in that quarter, for his young affections are decidedly engaged." "To whom?" questioned Brainard, starting from his seat. "Be quiet, my dear sir. Not to Miss Estelle. Therefore it is no affair of yours. He is in love with Miss Walton." "But she does not love him in return. She cannot, shall not. A little diminutive—" "Stop! Not so fast, my friend. Chadwick can compare with most men of my acquaintance, although he is not 6 foot high." But that is not to the purpose. You stand a fair chance of winning Miss Estelle if you will only act with caution. Remember, she carries weight. A man has not many such chances in his life. But as it is always wise to be prepared for emergencies and be guarded against disappointments, I came here this afternoon to propose introducing you to another lady, who could heal the wound in case Miss Estelle should prove inconstant." "Agreed," said Brainard, filling up a bumper. "Here's to success with the fair." He drained his glass and added, in an exhilarating tone, "Now I am ready for anything you like. Away with melancholy! Fa la la la! What an idiot I was to have laughed until I was 29 years old at Cupid and his archery, and to fancy myself wounded after all. But, as you say, it was the wine in my head, and now Richard's himself again. Bravo! We have not a moment to lose. We will stop in at Grandjean's, and on the way let him remodel your hair and beard. Then a visit to Miss Priscilla Adair. After that you can pay your devoirs to the Clintons and pass the evening. Lead on, gallant general, I follow. Tol-de-rol, life let us cherish." And thus singing, Brainard sauntered out of his chamber, but the song changed to a whistle as he descended the stairs, and to low humming after he passed out of the street door. He was not interrupted by Ellery until they turned the corner of Berkeley Street and entered Grandjean's. A few moments sufficed to effect a very marked alteration in the external appearance of Mr. Brainard. As soon as the gentlemen were once again in the street, he accosted his friend with, "Come, Ellery, give me a description of this new inamorata. I feel my heart almost gone already." "I am very sorry to have discovered that you have any heart at all. The sooner you forget it yourself, the better for your own peace. As for the lady of your love, that may be. She is not quite so young as Miss Estelle, nor quite so pretty, nor yet quite so romantic. Thank heaven for the last item. This Don Quixoteism does not agree with my constitution. Shall I proceed? Miss Adair is a lady of that certain age which Byron says the most uncertain age appears. She is one of those kind souls whose abundant charity leads them to trouble themselves perpetually with other people's affairs, and to make the private concerns of all the world their own. In person, no matter the casket, what is the value of the jewel? The world says $80,000, which is probably about 50,000, but this she has in her own right, and it ought to be sufficient to exclude all inconvenient acquaintances. There will be no waiting for her to come of age, you know, although it is to be hoped she has not arrived at years of discretion. The Adairs belong to our old-fashioned New York aristocracy, a class of persons that were once in the ascendant but have seen their best days in the beau monde, which have become too dreadfully mixed for their exclusiveness. Miss Adair has two brothers who were formerly men of wealth. They have each large families, and the rumor is that their fortunes have been consumed in speculations. Miss Adair has lived quite secluded until the last year. Suddenly she showed herself in society again, coquetted, received and rejected offers, and entertained all the young men about town. A man past 30 is her aversion. It is supposed that she is tired of the guardianship of her brother over her property, and is now determined that both she and it shall have a more interested and lawful protector. There we are. Do you feel prepared to enter the field? Prepared for anything. Sound the trumpet, or, in plain English, pull the bell, and let us in. I am impatient to rush into the presence of the fair enemy.
The door opened, and the gentlemen were ushered into a very fashionable-looking parlor.
Upon the cushioned sofa, half sat, half reclined, Miss Priscilla Adair. In her hand she held a volume upon which her eyes were intently fixed, but whether she was perusing it or not, the end of a spectacle case, which peeped ill-manneredly out of the pocket where it had been hastily slipped, made a doubtful question. Yet, on the other hand, the girlish style of her dress proved it to be quite impossible that the spectacles were made for use. "She is decidedly too substantial looking," thought Brainard at the first glance, "to prove romantic. I wonder whose dye she uses to color her eyebrows, and whether that yellowish hair, frizzed about her eyes to resemble tow, is her own. Her teeth came from Parmley's, that I'll swear." Such were the ejaculations passing through Brainard's mind, while Ellery introduced him as a particular friend, and one who had long been desirous of making the acquaintance of Miss Arria.
"I am happy to see you, Mr. Ellery, happy to see you, Mr. Brainard,"
said Miss Arria, with a curtsy which the stiffened limbs of belles of the present generation would find it difficult to imitate.
"Where have you been this long time, Mr. Ellery? Is your friend any relation to Mr. Alfred Brainard, who used to live in the Park Place? I see a resemblance, but I am so dreadfully short-sighted."
And Miss Adair drew a large round eyeglass from her belt, and, after adjusting her head on one side with a shrewd nod, which seemed to say, "There's no deceiving me through this glass," she placed it to her eye, and honored Mr. Brainard with a long, inquisitive stare. "My friend is no relation to Mr. Alfred Brainard, I believe."
"No, I knew Mr. Alfred Brainard quite well. That is to say, I have seen him very often. He used to visit a lady who lived opposite me, a married lady too, Mrs. Anthony. You know her, do you not?"
"Oh, quite well."
"A terrible flirt. I've watched her and seen Brainard go in there sometimes twice a day. A very wild young man, I suspect. It was shocking to live opposite such people. Where is she now?"
"In the city, I believe."
"Does Brainard visit her yet?"
"I'm sorry I cannot inform you."
"Oh, I warrant he does. Married women have such a way about them. They can—"
"Are you so opposed to the married state altogether, to disapprove of it?" asked Mr. Brainard in his blandest voice.
"I approve of it in some cases," replied the lady as blandly.
"Your disapproval in others has doubtless caused many a sleepless night," continued the gentleman in the same honeyed voice.
"What a remarkably pleasant young man your friend is," said Miss Adair
in a whisper to Ellery, while Brainard became suddenly deeply interested in an album lying near him.
"He seems to be a perfect gentleman, and very handsome. Where is he from?"
"From Baltimore. He has only been a few weeks in New York."
"Indeed! How old is he? Does he come on business or on pleasure? Is he rich?"
"He is about 27 or 8. His only business is pleasure. His father died a year or two ago and left him a cool $100,000, replied Ellery.
"Indeed! Really quite handsome. Mr. Brainard, I hope I may be favored with your name among others in that book."
"Certainly, madam. Unworthy as it is of occupying a place there, I cannot refuse anything that you request." The gentlemen prolonged their visit for half an hour, during which time Miss Adair, whose conversation consisted principally of questions, had learned a great many particulars from Mr. Ellery about her most intimate friends. An unusual number of opportunities were afforded Mr. Brainard for making agreeable remarks, and Miss Adair, who was fond of an aside, privately informed Mr. Ellery that she had never been so pleased with anybody in her life, and that he did not in the least resemble that profligate Mr. Alfred Brainard. Elated At the apparent strength of this second string to his bow, Mr. Brainard felt in such good spirits as he approached the Clintons that even Estelle's airs seemed to him less intolerable, and he expressed himself as having no doubt that if he chose he could be accepted by both the fair ones at a time. It was 9 o'clock before they reached the residence of Mr. Clinton. As they entered the parlor, the first person on whom Mr. Brainard's eye rested was Miss Walton. She was sitting beside Rachel, and both girls were, as usual, employed with their sewing. Was it the contrast with Rachel that made Arria look so beautiful, or the unusual flush on her cheek and the sparkling of her eye? Brainard's countenance suddenly brightened as he gazed on her, but as suddenly darkened when he noticed who sat in front of the young ladies. It was Edgar Chadwick, with a volume in his hand. He had been reading aloud some passages from a poem by Wordsworth. Near him sat Ester, with the Mysteries of Udolpho open upon her lap. But she, too, was listening to young Chadwick. Yes, to him rather than to Wordsworth, for it was the tones of the reader and the play of his features which fascinated her attention, not the beautiful reflections of the noble sentiments that he uttered. Brainard, as he wished the ladies good evening, could see nothing but Arria, and he was advancing to take a seat beside her when a warning look from Ellery withheld him, and he sank into a chair near Ester. His spirits were gone. He looked the very impersonation of a despairing lover, and Esther's heart sympathized with him, for she felt sure that his gloom had originated in her cruelty.
"Have you read the Mysteries of Udolpho, Mr. Brainard?"
"No, never. That is to say, yes, frequently. A thrilling tale, is it not? It makes my heart bleed."
"And mine. Happy the nature that can feel the woes of others."
"Yes, very."
"Is Miss Arria ill? She seems to be retiring."
And, unable to restrain himself any longer, Brainard hastily approached Arria. "Are you going to leave us so soon, Miss Walton? Must you so soon carry our sunshine away with you?" he added in a lower tone.
"Moonshine would be the more appropriate term, would it not?" replied Arria,
lightly. Then, fearing she had wounded his feelings, she added,
"I am very sorry to leave this pleasant company, but Mrs. Lemming does not like me to keep late hours, and it has struck 9. I must wish you all good evening. Will you permit me to
"My dear Brainard, you are treading on Miss Walton's dress," said Ellery, seizing the arm of Brainard with a rather tighter grip than was necessary to attract his attention. "Beware," he whispered. "I fancy Badger intends paying you another visit tomorrow morning. Do you never intend to be able to cut his acquaintance?" Brainard looked at him with a dull stare, as though he hardly comprehended the meaning of his words, and was following Arria, but Mr. Chadwick was already at her side, with his hat in hand, to accompany her home. Brainard turned, reseated himself beside Ester, and, hardly knowing what he did, took the hand which lay upon the arm of the chair in his. She withdrew it, yet not suddenly, and not indignantly, but rather as though she grieved to give him pain. Arria bent to give Ester for adieu, and Brainard trembled again as he felt the pure breath of the being whom he truly loved on his own cheek. It was but fancy, yet it deprived him of all ease and self-possession for the remainder of the evening.
"Farewell, Arria," said Ester. "We shall soon meet again."
"Farewell, Arria," echoed the heart of Brainard. "Oh, that we might soon meet again." End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4.
O love, young love, bound in thy rosy bands. Byron. "Pray, Miss Walton, Arria, pray do not so quicken your pace," said Mr. Chadwick, a few moments after he and Miss Walton had left the house of the Clintons. "Excuse me, I was hurrying home. like another Cinderella, for the hour at which I promised to return has already struck. Had we not better make haste? Must you, then, abridge a pleasure which I so seldom enjoyed, so long anticipated, that of acting as your protector, and being alone with you?" said he in a tremulous voice. Arria replied not, but her step, perhaps unconsciously, became slower. More than a square further they walked in perfect silence. "Arria, say Edgar, rather, have we not known each other long enough for you to call me by that name? To me it seems as though you had been a familiar spirit, ever since I learned to dream of a woman. You are the Egeria that, in my earliest youth, I pictured to myself, and thought I could love, the one being in whom I find my beau ideal, in manhood, and whom, therefore, I do love. Am I presumptuous in saying this? Have I hoped too much, because you evince towards me the same frank and affectionate manner with which you delight your friends? Was it all my hopeful folly, when I fancied sometimes that I had awakened your sympathy? Nay, was not the word I have used, for I know how fully you sympathize with all those around you. Dear Arria, will you not permit me to call you by that name?" The timid glance, the moist eye a moment lifted to his, the trembling arm he held within his own, these spoke all that Arria's tongue refused to express. "I have not, then, deceived myself," murmured Edgar, in a voice tremulous with happiness. "You listen to me, you do not turn away? You have been all the world to me, and you permit me to hope that I am something to you. The thought of you, Arria, has been many anxious months formed my whole happiness. Do you believe it in my power to form yours? Will you trust it in my keeping?" "If I can always make you feel as joyful as now, my happiness will be so cured," half whispered Arria. "You will consent, then, ever to remain near me, and cheer my hours of solitude, ever to teach me such sweet and holy lessons of truth and goodness as I have already learnt from your lips, to give me some foretaste of that abode of future happiness, in reality of which only the existence of such beings as you are could make me believe? And what have I to offer in return?" Edgar fancied he heard Arria breathe, "Your love," but it was the expression of her countenance, rather than the movement of her lips, which conveyed the idea. "I have only the wealth of the heart to lay at your feet," he continued, with a touch of humour which was natural to him, "and that will not purchase house and lands, and all else that, if we had the fairy's wishing cap, we might desire. I am but a young student, with all the gold I may ever possess, yet disencumbered from the rough soil of my brains. But as I am now, even so was my father 30 years ago, and he rides his carriage today. I have health, and, I hope, ordinary abilities. Is not this all that a young man in this happy land desire? Some foreigner says that it is easy for an American to make a fortune when he has none, as it is for him to spend one if he chances to have one left to him. I think my prospects bright while Arria smiles, and should they ever be darker, her smile must brighten them still. It shall, it will. Come the worst fate can send, that smile shall disarm her wrath. With you to protect, what incentive shall I have for exertion? And have I indeed secured myself such a lifelong source of joy? I can hardly credit my own happiness. Ah, Arria, will you never repent that you consented to become the light of a poor student's home? Shall I ever love him less? You question my love when you ask. I would soon as question— Hush, speak lower. We are just home. Bid me a hasty good night. I am afraid that is Mrs. Lemming at the window." "You shall not fear her long, loveliest and best beloved." "Hush, hush," whispered Arria timidly. "Leave me now, I beg of you." "Adieu, then, mine own Arria, mine forever. Adieu, my dear, dear Edgar." She had hardly uttered the words before the door opened, and she sprang into the house. But they resounded in Edgar's ears when he sought his pillow that night. In his dreams they were re-uttered in the same tenderly harmonious tone, and when morning sun fell brightly on the placid countenance of the sleeper, he awoke to spring up, repeating to himself, "Dear, dear Edgar." End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5.
His name could sadden and his acts surprise. Byron. It was a bright noon. Broadway was thronged with smiling faces and rainbow toilettes, with fair girls who know of no other place in which to display their finery, wives who had abjured every resort of the gay world except its gayest promenade, young men who were walking against time, hoping to annihilate him by the process, old maids who came to be seen and to criticize whatever they saw, young maids whose thoughts were engrossed in showing one another their lovers, while they seemed to be listening to the tale outpoured in their delighted ears. Among the latter was Esther Clinton, and beside her walked Augustus Brainard. The young lady looked languid and mournful as usual, and the young gentleman as though "Vive la bagatelle" was the only sentiment he could utter with sincerity.
"How I weary of these brick walls and this dull city! I sigh for the verdure of the woodland, the song of the birds, and the gush of the cool spring," exclaimed Esther.
"You are always sighing," thought Brainard, but he answered, "While you are so formed as to give charm to either the city or the country, both are alike to me." They were just crossing a street. Esther, with her head bent thoughtfully downward, found her eyes of little service. With an exclamation of great terror, Brainard suddenly drew her back, and at the same time shielding her from some impending danger by courageously stretching out his arms in front of her. "My dear Miss Clinton, in another moment those vile beasts would have trampled you under their feet. I do not know when I have been so very much alarmed."
"Noble, self-sacrificing man, this is the second time you have preserved my life," replied Esther gratefully. "How can I reward you?"
Mr. Brainard was about availing himself of this opportunity of informing her in what manner she could very fully reward him, when he was interrupted by somebody seizing his disengaged arm and very affectionately drawing it through his own. "Ah, Brainard, my dear fellow, how do you do? Delighted to find you at last. Been looking for you all over New York every day this week. Delighted to see you. Pretty girl you've got here," he added in a loud whisper. "Who is she? Great country this. Great women. Finest women in the world. Introduce me." Mr. Brainard was so perfectly confounded that, although he did not drop at full length in the street, which was his first impulse, and though he continued to walk on, he could not gather courage to notice his friend's request. Mr. Badger, however, always being at his ease, and presuming that Mr. Brainard did not understand him, stretched his conveniently long neck forward, and with an insinuating leer, which he intended should do some execution, thus addressed the wondering Esther. "How do you do, miss? Feel honored to have had made the pleasure of making your acquaintance. A fine day this, a very fine day. Many fine days in this country, nothing like it." Brainard saw the absolute necessity of putting a good face on the matter, and by a great effort recovered himself. Turning to Esther with a pale cheek and a quivering lip, he said, "Miss Clinton, allow me to present my friend, Mr. Badger." particular friend, my dear fellow," whispered Badger. "How do you do again, Miss Clinton? I shall call Brainard here one of the best friends I have in the world if he introduces me to so much beauty every day." And Mr. Badger made a short halt to accomplish the bow which he deemed it incumbent upon him to make. "He is a good fellow, but rather eccentric," remarked Brainard, sotto voce, to Esther. "For my sake, bear with him until I can explain." "By the power, there goes Mark Matheson. Did you see that olive-colored coach with those yellow linings? That man owes Benninger $500. Isn't that sublime? Know Mr. Matheson, Miss Clinton?"
"No, sir, I know him not."
"You don't say! An acquaintance of mine, a very particular friend. Wife ran away from him, trying to get her back. Can't do it, though. Law won't make her. Fine woman, fine. Intend paying him a visit tomorrow."
"My dear Badger, I know you will permit me to speak freely with you. I have really something very special to say to this young lady. That misfortune in your foot makes your pace rather too slow. Excuse me if I walk a little ahead of you."
Not at all, my dear fellow. Don't let my foot annoy you. Never comes in my way. I can walk as fast as you like."
Mr. Badger mended his gait as Mr. Brainard quickened his, or marred it rather, for the pace at which he attempted to walk made his limp almost superfluously obvious. "This is too bad, Badger. 'Pon my word, I have something particular to say to the lady."
"Certainly, my fellow. I shan't disturb you in the least. None so deaf as those who won't hear, you know. Just fancy me a post, and when you've done, I want to talk to the lady myself. Now don't be too monopolizing, mustn't he, Miss Clinton?"
"I heard you not, sir."
"I say that Brainard here mustn't monopolize you altogether. Great country this, and a free one. All men enjoy its privileges equally. Best things in it are the women. Fine women, finest women in the world. Ain't they, Brainard? Hey?"
"Your sentiment is a very just one, Mr. Badger, and—"
"Say no more."
Mr. Badger's drawl, as he gave forth this new sentiment, bore some resemblance to his mode of walking, for he made a limping pause between each word, as between every step, yet dexterously connected it with the following one. "Mr. Badger, will you listen to reason? Will you—"
"Say no more."
"But I must say more, sir, and I will tell you."
"Why, Brainard, my dear fellow, why?"
And Badger gave a long, ludicrous, searching stare into the countenance of Mr. Brainard.
"Why, you've been uncorking champagne already this morning. You have. I know it."
Mr. Badger burst into a hearty laugh, shaking his head very reproachfully at Mr. Brainard the whole time. When his mirth had somewhat subsided, he again stretched forth his swan-like throat towards Miss Clinton, and winking his left eye at her while he pointed his thumb at Mr. Brainard, said, "Don't you see something queer about him this morning? I saw it at once, your ladyship. I've just discovered Shall I peach Mr. Brainard?" Mr. Brainard's lips grew white with smothered rage. He clenched his teeth together, and scowling on Badger, strove to speak, but he only gave utterance to something resembling a low growl.
"Did you see that lady in blue and scarlet, Miss Clinton? Fine woman. Know her very well. Her husband—"
"Let us have an end to this farce, Badger. I know what you want. Call at my rooms tomorrow at 10, and I promise you that you shall be satisfied. Promises ain't so good as pie crust sometimes. Didn't I call you last you told me? And didn't I find the cage open and the bird flown? You can't come that gammon over me any more. Since you will talk of business, I'll tell you my intentions. I've found you now, and I like you too well to part company. When you're ready to walk home, so am I, and then we can talk this matter over at our ease. First, my feelings as a gentleman." And Badger touched the left side of his coat. "Prompt me to take care of the lady. After that, to business." Mr. Badger spoke with earnestness, but in too low a tone for more than a casual word to meet Esther's ear. "But you do know you are frustrating perhaps the only means I shall ever have of paying you." "Ah, indeed! Plenty of spoons, eh?" And Mr. Badger playfully touched his nose with his thumb, and at the same time quivering his fingers to signify that he understood. "Yes, as a man of sense you must see the necessity of leaving me now, and tomorrow at 10 I shall not fail you." "Say no more! You attack me in a tender place when you use the ladies as an argument," said Mr. Badger aloud. "He does, Miss Clinton, I assure you he does. But since you young folks want to be laughed together, I won't spoil sport. So good morning, a very good morning, Miss Clinton. Happy to have made your acquaintance. Brainard, my good fellow, good morning." Mr. Badger swept his hat gracefully through the air and passed on. Brainard drew a long breath, which seemed to relieve his chest from some invisible weight, and his cheeks, before quite pale, became flushed with burning crimson.
"What a very singular person! How he alarmed me! Is he insane, Mr. Brainard?"
said Esther, clinging for protection to her companion's arm. "Yes, a little, that is, on one or two subjects. Poor fellow! I really do pity him. Shall I tell you the truth? Pray don't mention it. The fact is that the sight of a beautiful woman completely upsets him. He must have caught a glimpse of you as we passed by, and having seen me once or before twice, he determined to claim an acquaintance for the sake of being near you. I knew his weakness and humored him. Can you pardon me? Pardon you for succoring the unfortunate? How can you ask me such a question?" Brainard drew another long breath, which seemed to benefit even more than the former one. But in proportion as his spirits rose, those of Esther sank, and Brainard, observing her mood, thought it dangerous to resume the conversation which Mr. Badger had so inopportunely interrupted. Mr. Badger looked back once or twice as he pursued his way down Broadway, and gave Brainard a patronizing nod, which the latter gentleman could not have observed, for he never once had the civility to return it. "What's next?" soliloquized Mr. Badger, as he drew a long and narrow strip of paper from his pocket. "Let me see. Cummings, Catterfly, Nielsen, Never Pay, Morrison, Mordaunt. Ah, Mordaunt. That's just on my way. Must say a word or two to that chap today. Ugh, what a wry face he'll make. No gentleman. He treats a man of my standing like a dog. Gentlemen that are gentlemen respect the talents in all its varieties. Here's for Mordaunt. Never bled that old quiz yet. Will go hard with me if I can't find some soft place to stick the lancet today." Away darted Mr. Badger, for he knew the value of his own time, and how much of it was unnecessarily consumed by his acquaintances. His onward course was only interrupted by a few hearty shakes of his hands, which he thought it necessary to dispense among his particular friends.
He stopped before a 3-story house in Pearl Street, near the Battery. The building stood almost entirely alone. The faded paint on the bricks and the door, the dilapidated blinds, and the yellowish shutters, closed throughout the house, gave it a gloomy and deserted appearance. Mr. Badger mounted the steps. There was no bell, and the knocker was too much rusted to move without giving forth some sounds of complaint. Badger's practised hand, however, extracted from it a noise that would have roused 7 sleepers. The summons was unanswered. Again Badger lifted the knocker and dexterously eased its stiffened hinges with another peal. Still no answer. A 3rd time he seized the noisy instrument, and only relinquished it after taking some more severe gymnastic exercise than was his custom. The key at last turned, several bolts were undrawn, the door opened just wide enough for the person within to ascertain who stood without, and the croaking voice of an aged female sulkily demanded, "What be you making all this noise about?" "Very sorry to disturb you, my good lady, very. To take so much trouble boxing your door, no use, trouble never gets paid for. Mr. Mordaunt at home, my respected lady." "None of your lady and palavering here. There bean't no ladies in this house. Mr. Mordaunt aren't at home." "Didn't suppose he was, only asked for information. Take care," continued Mr. Badger, placing his club foot forcibly against the door, which the woman was attempting to shut in his face. "Have a word to say to you, my dear lady. Always delighted to talk with the ladies. Mr. Mordaunt ain't home, eh? Suppose he's coming home, though. Just about his dinner hour. Smell the dinner quite strong. Good soup you make, quite good. Keen nose, this." Mr. Badger designated the organ he alluded to in a manner which pointed out its locality even more decidedly than nature's lavish hand had done. "I don't know when Mr. Mordaunt will come home. You'd best call again," said the old woman. "Bless your beautiful old face! Not the slightest use of that. Suppose I don't know better manners when I'm visiting a gentleman? Don't trouble yourself. I'll come in and take a seat in the parlor. Oh, door opens hard. Must grease the hinges." As Mr. Badger said these words, he inserted his stick into the crevice of the door, for the old woman was pushing against it with all her strength, and gently pried it open. "Lord a mercy save us, you ain't going to knock one down and talk of manners, be you?" "Pardon me, my dear lady, I thought I could assist you. Stupid door, very stupid. What's greasing?" Mr. Badger gallantly assisted the grumbling old woman to rise from her half-recumbent posture, and saved her the trouble of closing the street door by shutting it himself. After this he walked along the entry and turned the first door-knob. The room was locked. He tried the next. The door opened, and he entered the back parlor, followed by the old woman, who continued to mutter and groan. The room was cheerless and almost devoid of furniture. A small table in the center was partially spread for dinner. Mr. Badger seized upon the well-warmed arm-chair, which was placed before the solitary plate, and, drawing it to the window, peered through the dusty panes, as though he was expected to enjoy some scenery. The yard was large and filled with noxious weeds grown to the height of shrubs. Mr. Badger gazed upon them with evident satisfaction. "Fine garden, rich soil, good growth here. Sublime, ain't it? Take care of it all yourself. Ladies love flowers. Amiable weakness, isn't it? You be not going to stay here, sir. Mr. Mordaunt won't be home for more'n an hour." "Don't let it afflict you, my dear lady. I'm quite disengaged. Very comfortable here. Don't mind waiting. But who's going to stay with you here to wait on you? I's got dinner to cook. All them fish will be burnt to death. I smell 'em burning now." "Oh, don't let the fish spoil. Very sorry to lose your delightful company, but dinner must be attended to. Don't stand on ceremony, my dear lady. I'll entertain myself with the prospect from this window." The old woman lingered, giving forth at intervals a low, querulous sound. but the odor of burning fish became so perceptible that it drew her irresistibly away. "Mind you don't stir out of this room," said she, and hobbled downstairs to save her master's dinner from the consuming element. Mr. Badger sat a while in contemplative mood, gazing on the weeds and probably reflecting on the weed-like growth of sin. When he wearied of this fascinating occupation, he looked around the room, but the remnants of faded furniture were too time-worn to bear much examination. "Considerable of a house of this for such an old quiz, living all alone. No use to him at all. Wonder why he don't sell it. Bring more than enough to pay his debts 50 times over. Wonder what he does with the upper story. Just take a peep now I'm here to see what the house would bring at auction." Mr. Badger left the room on his errand of investigation and ascended the stairs. He tried every door of the second story, but found them all locked. He was ascending the flight which led to the third story when he paused suddenly. His ear caught a wild, low strain of music, which seemed to proceed from some chamber above. It was the sound of a female voice. While Mr. Badger stood listening in wonder, the song ceased. The next moment it burst forth again in a wilder, louder strain. Mr. Badger's composure fortunately never forsook him. Led by the sound, he continued ascending the flights of steps until he found himself in the attic. "Some pretty chambermaid," thought he. "Take a peep at all events. Get her perhaps to remind her master, when she's making his bed every morning, of his little account. No harm in trying." The singing continued, now loud, now low, now joyful, and now sad. Mr. Badger approached the room from which it proceeded, and gently tapped upon the door. The song proceeded, and no answer was made. The next time he knocked, louder and louder grew the song, but still no answer. He then attempted to lift the latch, but the door was locked and the key extracted. This was too much for Mr. Badger. True, his joints were somewhat stiff, and they cracked reluctantly as he compelled them to obedience, but he knelt down, notwithstanding, and put his eye to the keyhole. "Why, that old profligate! Who'd have suspected it? Ain't this sublime? Why, he's got a woman locked up here. Great country this, great country!" And Mr. Badger rubbed his hands in unfeigned delight. "Fine woman, superb! Pale, though, very pale. Not enough of her, quite. Afraid the old quiz don't feed her very well. Black hair hanging down to her knees, like the mad woman in the play. What big black eyes! Who's she looking at? Nobody there? Talking to somebody, though. Can't see another soul in the room. Singing again now. What the deuce makes her squeeze her hands together in that outlandish fashion? Little white hands, white as her dress. Nothing like a woman's hand. That old profligate! Looking so blue all the while. And this the way he's amusing himself? Great country this, great country. Greatest country in the world, that's certain." Mr. Badger entertained himself a few moments longer at the keyhole, until the wind which eddied through it made his eyes water, when, all at once, he appeared to become sensible of the impropriety of spying the actions of a lady while she was unconscious of his presence, and called out, "Beg your pardon, my lady. How do you do this morning? Delighted to make your acquaintance. Fine day, your ladyship. Very fine day. Is Mr. Mordaunt at home?" A wild shriek issued from the chamber at these words, and then came cries of, "Let me out! Let me out! Oh, let me out!" succeeded by agonizing sobs and moans. "Don't be alarmed, your ladyship. It's only me. Never alarm the ladies. Don't scream now, don't. Only just wanted to know how you did. Hope your ladyship—" Mr. Badger was interrupted by the clutch of a hand which grasped him fiercely about the nape of his neck. He turned so abruptly that his head knocked against that of some other person. The old woman was bending over him. At first glance He thought the place that of a demon, so full was it of satanic rage and fury. Beg pardon, my dear lady. Hope I didn't hurt you very much. Here he be, master, shrieked the old beldame at the top of her cracked voice. I hope to mercy you'll pitch him out of the window, or he'll ruin us. These words were succeeded by a quick, heavy tread on the stairs, and before Mr. Badger could rise from his lowly posture, Mr. Mordaunt was standing before him. Mr. Mordaunt's livid countenance expressed fear and horror rather than wrath. For a few seconds the two looked at each other in silence, Mr. Mordaunt as though he was too petrified to speak, and Mr. Badger with an air of virtuous yet playful rebuke. At length the latter slowly rose from his knees and exclaimed, shaking his head, "Oh, you old reprobate! Didn't think of you, I didn't. Hadn't sowed your wild oats yet, eh? Fine woman, fine eyes, sings like an opera woman at the part. Introduce me, will you?" Mr. Mordaunt stretched out his arm, and touching Mr. Badger on the shoulder, hoarsely whispered, "Come down." "Pitch him out the window, master!" screamed the old woman. Mordaunt looked at her with a frown, exclaimed, "Silence! Go in and see that all is right." "You introduce me, then," said Badger. "Well, as you like. Don't want anybody else to ruffle the feathers of your bird, eh? Right, sir, quite right."
"Mr. Badger, have the goodness to follow me downstairs."
"Certainly, certainly." Why, the old prig is growing quite civil, thought Mr. Badger. The influence of a woman, nothing like it. The influence of a woman makes lambs of us. They entered the parlor. Mr. Mordaunt closed the door, pointed out a chair to Mr. Badger, and sank into one himself. At first he appeared to be too much overcome to speak, and Mr. Badger very considerately looked out the window, remarking, "Fine growth you've got out there."
"Mr. Badger," at last said Mr. Mordaunt, "the unfortunate discovery you have made—"
"Not at all. Don't let it distress you, my dear fellow. Know how to make allowances for the weaknesses of human nature. No creature comfort, after all, like a downright pretty woman, like one myself sometimes. Yours looks rather pale, though."
"Yes, you are very considerate, sir. I am much obliged to you, Mr. Badger, and I have one great favor to ask. The lady, the person you saw, desires to live in the greatest seclusion, as her health—"
"Poorly, I dare say. She looks poorly. Must make her take the air. Give her color. Take my advice. Don't keep her too confined. It won't do with a woman."
"I thank you for your advice, sir. My request is that you will promise never to reveal the discovery you have made."
"Of course not. Man of honor, sir. Touch me on a tender point."
"I have your promise, then?"
"To be sure. Wouldn't lisp a word of it for the world. By the by, that reminds me of something I forgot to mention. Slip of paper here. You'll oblige me by looking it over. Great deal of business on hand this afternoon. Like you to settle yours without delay. Dinner getting spoiled. Lady up there looked hungry."
"Never mention her again if you hope to get a farthing of the money," said Mr. Mordaunt, so sternly that his visitor almost jumped out of his seat. Mr. Mordaunt opened an old desk and took from it 2 or 3 bills and some silver. "This is the last money I have in the world. Take it. But unless you hope to repent most bitterly, remember there is one subject to which you are never to allude."
"Oh, certainly. 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shillings. $12 and 5 shillings. That leaves $17 yet due. Pay me tomorrow?"
"Impossible. I have not another shilling in the world. But keep your promise. I will pay. I will call upon you next week."
"Don't trouble yourself. I never trouble people that way. Step around myself next Tuesday."
"I hope to save you the necessity. And now, Mr. Badger, as I am somewhat fatigued, I beg you'll excuse me."
"Want to get rid of me, eh? Going to pay a visit to—" Mr. Badger pointed upwards with his thumb, and at the same time significantly jerking up his left shoulder. "Silence! Never mention that subject again," almost shouted Mr. Mordaunt. "Oh, beg your pardon. Won't detain you. Shall call next Thursday. Present my oh, now don't mean to offend. Good morning. I wish you a very good morning. Don't forget Tuesday." Mr. Badger left the house well pleased with his visit, so well that he determined to deprive himself of dinner until he had paid another. "Who's next? Let's see. Edgar Chadwick, $10 to his bootmaker. That's in Waverly Place. We'll take the bus and be there in 5 minutes, just to catch him at dinner. Never had a bill against him before. Green. That makes him a pony up at once." Mr. Badger hailed an omnibus, jumped in, and looked around to see whether any of his particular friends were present, and with whom he could transact a little business in his line. For once he was disappointed. The stage stopped for him to alight at Waverly Place, without his having met a single acquaintance. He took his way to one of the most elegant mansions in the street. "Mr. Chadwick at home?" "No, sir." "Suppose the doctor's at home?" The servant, being unaccustomed to visitors of Mr. Badger's character, replied, "Yes, sir, he is, and Mr. Edgar will be here by dinner time." "Oh, will he? Quite right. I'll wait. Let the doctor know that a gentleman wants to see him." "Yes, sir. Please walk into the office." Mr. Badger walked in, and soon after a portly-looking personage, with peculiarly neat and jaunty exterior, entered the room. "Dr. Chadwick. How do you do, sir? Happy to make your acquaintance. My name's Badger, sir. Badger. Fine day, fine. Had the honor to call on Master Edgar." "My son's not home, sir. I was informed that you had some business with me." "Not that honor, sir. Sorry to say it. A slip of paper here for Master Edgar. A fine young man. Presume you're his banker. Quite as lieve transact business with you, sir. Small account I have the honor to collect for Mr. Wagner, the bootmaker." "Let me see it. $10! Has there been any difficulty in my son's paying the account, that it was placed in your hands?" "Can't say, sir. Mr. Wagner's generally impatient, very impatient man. Always likes the cash down, all alike, sir. Gentlemen in trade want their money, and gentlemen out of trade won't pay. Great country this, great country." "Receipt the account, sir. Here's the money, and I hope this is the last bill that may ever be presented in this manner against my son." "Certainly, sir. It is a pleasure to be treated in this gentlemanly way. Persons of my profession, sir, know a gentleman at a glance. Your children, those 2 little lambs in the entry, beautiful darlings, very like you, sir, very like. Great country, this great country. Fine children, finest children in the world." As Mr. Badger ran merrily down the front steps, he came into contact with Mr. Chadwick, who was briskly ascending them. "Beg pardon, sir. Had a little business with you. Your father settled it. Excellent father, yours. He's a gentleman, sir, a gentleman. An honor to his country. Great country this. Great fathers." And Mr. Badger, seeing another omnibus in the distance, abruptly finished his discourse and vanished. "That is an odd individual I met this moment on the steps. Do you know who he is, sir?" asked Edgar, as he entered the drawing-room. "I am afraid his errand was to make your acquaintance. I am grieved to find that you have already commenced receiving visits of a collector. And for so trifling a sum. He had a bill of $10 against you for boots. Is that possible? Why, the money has not been due 10 days. That speaks badly for your credit, my son. Here comes your mother. Let us go in to dinner, and we will talk over this matter." The family party seated themselves at table, and the worthy doctor helped his wife, his son, and himself, and dismissed the waiter, before he resumed the subject of Mr. Badger. "You are very young, my son, to have a bill presented to you in such a manner. Not 23 until next June, are you? The life of a young physician, who has his fortune to make, is not the easiest in the world. I know something of his struggles from experience. Now, if a man can very easily save himself all this trouble, do you see any reason why he should not do it? No, provided he may do it honorably. But really I do not understand you. Have patience, and I will explain. I hear the bells call you a handsome and agreeable young fellow, though your mother and I— here the doctor looked humorously at his wife— may think you an ordinary puppy. It is very fortunate that some peoples are of a different opinion. Go on, my dear sir. I am quite too polite to contradict that. Edgar, said his mother, your father takes a long time to tell his story, so I will assist in getting you at the cream of it at once. Have you any antipathy to matrimony? Quite the contrary. Then, of course, you have no objection to a rich wife. That is another part of speech. Perhaps I have. I shall never marry a woman that I do not love. Fiddle-de-dee, exclaimed the doctor. All boys talk so. You'll outgrow that nonsense. Then I shall do more than my father or mother have done, replied Edgar, smiling on the contented-looking couple. The smile was reflected on both their faces, but the calculating spirit of the father would not permit him to be so soon driven from his purpose. My son, as I have said before, a young physician has to struggle, as you struggled 30 years ago, my dear sir, and at the end of that time he may gain your enviable position. Not so certain. Even if it was, I do not desire to see you go through the furnace as I have done. Not if I come forth gold 7 times refined. No, no, I tell you. Therefore do not jest any more, or you will make me lose my temper. I am in earnest. Some of my patients informed me yesterday that Miss Esther Clinton shows a decided preference for you. Now, you cannot do better than marry her. With your permission, I think I can do much better. I do not aspire to give you quite so romantic and troublesome a daughter-in-law as Miss Esther. We will not find her money in the least troublesome, I promise you. When I marry, it will be with a woman, not a money-bag, a woman who I love, and whom my parents cannot help loving. But Miss Esther will never be my wife. In a word, my affections are engaged elsewhere. I last night offered her hand, and was accepted. You did you? And I suppose you expect my consent, said the doctor, with much anger as surprise. I hope for it. But should it be unreasonably refused, I must content myself without it. Unreasonably? Without it? Let me tell you, you headstrong young dog, you— Edgar, why will you exasperate your father so needlessly? Let him know the lady's name, and I dare say all will be right. I am proud in naming her. I can name Miss Arria Walton. Miss Walton! Shouted the father. Miss Walton! Screamed the mother. Edgar, you're out of your senses. She has not a cent in the world. Pardon me, my dear mother, but had you any fortune when you married to my father? If I obtain as good a wife as my mother has been, that is all I desire. You certainly cannot find fault with my treading in the steps of my parents. But I do find fault, and I shall take care you shall not do it, sir. Pray, how do you expect to support Miss Walton? Interrogated the doctor. By my profession. If her poverty is your only objection to the lady, certainly it cannot be insurmountable. But it is not my only objection. Family consideration is something. Family purity is a great deal. Who is Miss Arria's father? And who has ever heard of her mother? I will tell you. Her father is, in all probability, Mr. Mordaunt, and her mother some woman who was too great a disgrace for her sex for Mr. Mordaunt to make his wife. Is the offspring of such a woman that you intend to present to me as a daughter? If it is, sir, she never comes under this roof.
I have laid up some little fortune through my hard industry, but if you bring this disgrace upon my name, I have bequeathed to you, my money shall never be yours. I will give it to the orphan asylum rather. If you have so poor an opinion of my abilities as a physician, perhaps you think that even then it may benefit some of my offspring, replied Edgar, laughing good-humouredly. Do you make a jest of me, sir? By heavens, I have a great mind.
My dear husband, do not be hasty. Edgar was always better managed by gentle means rather than harsh.
I have only one word to say. So long as he lives, he shall never marry Miss Walton with my consent. If he marries her without it, I will never leave him a shilling. You have used the very worst argument in the world by which to influence me, my dear father. I am of the opinion that nothing can be more prejudicial to the interest of a young man than the possession of a fortune. Even had I thought otherwise, you can think so poorly of me as to suppose that I would sacrifice the happiness of my whole life to mercenary considerations, that I would barter enjoyment for gold.
But, my son, said Mrs. Chadwick gently,
you will surely not marry a woman with a stain upon her name. If the stain came not through her own acts, I would not hesitate one moment to do so. Is she answerable for the sins of others? Would I be just in making her so? Then you insist on marrying the girl, demanded the doctor. Although I shall sincerely regret your groundless opposition, I do, replied Edgar. Then I can tell you that within these doors you shall never bring her, and that 1 cent of my money shall never go to buy her bread.
Let us drop the subject for present, pleaded Miss Chadwick.
You are both warm,
and you may change your opinions.
Not I, for one, said the doctor positively.
And I must echo the words of my father, replied young Chadwick with equal determination.
Mrs. Chadwick made an imploring signal to her husband to say no more, and he reluctantly obeyed. The rest of the dinner would have been devoured in silence but for the lively sallies of Edgar, who had probably anticipated his father's opposition. When the dishes were removed, finding the doctor unwilling to converse, he took his hat and walked out. Mrs. Chadwick then drew her chair close to her husband, and coaxingly drawing the newspaper from his hand, said, "We may prevent all this disturbance, if you like, without trying to combat Edgar." "I should like to know how," was the surly reply.
"Listen, then, and see if you do not approve of my plan. Miss Walton probably does not suspect the unfortunate situation in which she stands with the world. She is a girl of great refinement and delicacy of feeling."
"A fig for her refinement! She was refined enough to catch my son."
"Hear me out. You are acquainted with the Lemmings. Suppose you call on them, have an interview with Miss Walton, and plainly inform her of your objections to the match, and your reasons. If she is the girl I suppose her to be, she will at once refuse Edgar, and we will have no further trouble."
"Excellent, wife, excellent. Leave a woman alone for a plot. I'll do it. No fear but I can work on her feelings."
"Not the slightest. Then you must make her promise that she will not state her reasons for rejecting Edgar to him, and not even mention your interview with her."
"Precisely. That will settle the matter. We'll see, Master Edgar," said the doctor, "whether you will marry when I will say you shall not. We'll see."
End of chapter 5.